This is a May 9th, 1989 oral history interview with Mr. Gregorio Salazar of Houston, Texas, about his days as a member of the Mexican American Youth Organization, better known as MAYO. Gregorio, the first thing I'd like to ask you about is your background. Where were you born and raised? Where were you from?
I was born in San Antonio, but we moved to Houston when I was about 9 years old, so I essentially consider myself a Houstonian. That's basically it, you know, San Antonio and Houston.
How old were you said?
About 9 years old, something like that.
Where'd you go to school here?
I went to school at Luskin Elementary, and then I went to Marshall, which was a very weird place even then, and then to Reagan in the Heights.
Okay. Where?
And the University of Houston.
And you went where?
University of Houston.
You went to the University of Houston. How long did you go there?
A couple of years.
Did you graduate?
No, I just couldn't deal with it. It was I don't know. It just wasn't the environment for me at the time. This was after MAYO, actually. There was a gap between the time that I got out of high school. Right after high school, got involved in MAYO more or less, and so there was a gap there because of that. And so when I started up again, I think I just felt. I think the problem was I thought I knew too much, you know. And I mean, I'd had all these experiences and all these things that happened, and here I am in a situation where they're still trying to treat you like a child, and I was just having difficulty with it. So I took the scholarship money and went to Europe, you know. It didn't make more sense at the time, you know. But it was okay. I didn't, you know, there were some things about it that I liked a lot, and I was working with Dr. Conan. I'm not sure if you know him, at the Institute for Urban Studies, doing research on the Texas Constitution at that time. So, I mean, it was a very nice setup for me there, but I just couldn't relate to the whole situation, you know. I mean, we went from one extreme to the other, you know, from being on the street and doing whatever we wanted to a very controlled kind of environment where I wasn't I wasn't allowed to speak out. I had one class in Texas government or something, and this particular professor was saying something about SDS in '68 or whenever it was, and I happened to have been there at the time with those people. I knew who they were. I didn't agree with what he was saying, so I made a point of disagreeing with him in class, and the following day he said, he called out my name and he said, I just want to make clear that I do the lecturing here, you know. So I figured, okay, I get the message. That was that, you know. Things like that just, you know.
When were you born? What year?
1950.
1950. What date?
July 26th.
July 26th.
Cuban Independence Day.
Cuban
as it turned out.
When did you graduate from high school?
I think it was 69. Something 69. Like that, yeah. It was 69. Yeah.
So you went right from being out of high school into MAYO.
Yeah. There was a little gap in there when I went to Chicago, not for the Democratic Convention, but right after that. There was a series of demonstrations organized to, I don't remember exactly what the occasion was, but there was something going on in Chicago, right? It may have been something to do with the Democratic Convention riots. And that's when all this factionalism was developing with the Yippies and the Black Panthers and so on, you know, all that stuff that was going on at that time. This friend of mine, who, Alex Rodriguez, who was a member of MAYO also, I think we got involved through Space City News or something like that. And anyway, we ended up in Chicago. And so when we came back, we worked with Space City News for a bit. We were kind of like I wouldn't say token, but I would say at least the resident Mexicans, you know. And I would occasionally do stories for them and stuff, but we were looking for something, basically, something political that we could involve ourselves in, something that went beyond LULAC and that kind of a, you know, more establishment or whatever type Mexican-American organization, because we were basically coming from a more radical point of view, and so there wasn't anything, but then we started hearing about the Great Boycott people, and then we heard about MAYO and so on. And so one day we knew where the office was. It was in the neighborhood, in the north side, which is where I was raised. And it was located right next to Jeff Davis High School. And it was actually the farm worker's office, and MAYO just kind of hung out there. They had a desk, and I think the Brown Berets were in there as well. I never could figure out who the hell the Brown Berets were or what they did, but you know, we always heard about the Brown Berets. You know.
Let me stop you here, Gregorio, and ask you to go back a little bit. Your parents, I mean, you say you were looking for a more militant posture. You were coming from a more militant posture. How do you explain that in your own life? What were your parents like? I mean, did they give you any? Were they politically oriented people at all?
I think my grandfather was, and he was always involved in democratic politics, or whatever you want to call it, in San Antonio for a long time. You know, he was very active in that kind of thing, and plus hearing stories from him about, you know, things in Mexico. Although he was born in the United States, but you know, he knew about things going on in Mexico, as far as the church, and he wasn't. He believed in God, but he was very anti-religion. Anti-church, I should say, you know. So these kinds of attitudes, perhaps that was a basis, I don't know. My parents never really expressed any, what you would call radical ideas or anything. They're fairly conventional Democrats, you know, but I think everybody in my family is pretty much. I'm sure there are some exceptions, some aunts and uncles or whatever, but it pretty much follows in line with that sort of old-style liberal politics. You know, they believe that things can be better, things should be better, and
very reform-minded.
Yeah, they recognize the injustices that exist. You know, either because they've been subjected to them, or they've gone past that in a sense. You don't let go of that just because you're no longer, you know, just because you're not hungry at the moment. You know, you don't forget about that. So, I mean, I guess that would be it. Also, they've always given me an enormous amount of freedom. That's good and bad in a way, you know. But I've always communicated with them. Whatever was happening in MAYO, you know. Well, my mother would joke about it and say, well, I just have to watch television to see, you know, if you were in any trouble or whatever. And basically their attitude was, as long as you let us know what you're up to and you know, you don't get yourself killed, then we'll support you, you know. They weren't always happy about it. You know, I'm not saying that things were perfect.
Was your dad, what was his profession, and your mother?
My father's, he's retired now, but he basically did whatever, that kind of a thing. You know, he worked for a battery company for a long time, and then that company went out of business. Then he worked as a longshoreman, and he worked at the refineries in Pasadena doing construction, and just about everything, you know, kind of thing.
And your mom? My
mother's done maintenance primarily, and she worked in office buildings for a while, and she works at the medical center now. It's a terrible job. I mean,
but she was a working woman, has been a working woman.
Well, it has been for, I'd say, the last, because I remember when that used to be an issue about my mother working, you know, but that was in the old days. Now I think most men would rather their wives work.
Yeah.
She's been working at least 10 or 15 years, you know.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have a sister who's a little older. You're not, about almost 2 years older than I am.
Was she politically oriented at all?
Not really. Again, you know, she's got the right politics if you force the issue on her, but it's not something that is part of her everyday kind of life or whatever. You know, I mean, at least at some point during the day, the issue of politics will come up, you know, in conversation or whatever, or I respond or something. You know what I'm saying? It's like a consciousness about it. Can't really get away from it. They don't really think about those things. You know, she's more concerned with dealing with her kids or this or that. You know, and but I think if something were to develop where, you know, she needed to take a stand, she probably would. You know.
And y'all lived in what part of town?
The north side.
The north side.
The near north side.
All right. What street?
Well, I think mostly on Bernard. Not Bernard, I'm sorry, that's in Montrose. On Boswell.
On Boswell.
Which is where my parents are still living.
I see. You said something that was interesting about the about Marshall Junior High. What you said it was weird even then. What was the situation?
Well, I haven't been there in a long time, so I don't know. I'm assuming it's still weird.
How was it?
It was first of all, it was a very awful building. It was just most of what is Marshall now was not there before. It was a single building, and mostly these temporary built shacks or whatever you want to call it. So beyond the fact that it was a very depressing environment, Most of the teachers, if not all of the teachers, were Anglo. I don't think there were any Mexican teachers at the time. And it was basically, well, there were a lot of pachucos, or people who wanted to be pachucos, you know.
Who aspired to be
pachucos kind of thing. And it was just a very rough school. You know, there was violence and the usual kind of stuff. And I was had developed sort of a clique of people. There were like maybe 10 of us or less, and men and women, and we sort of considered ourselves the elite in the sense that we didn't want anything to do with these people. And it was kind of a, you know, I mean, I'm wearing surfer haircuts and trying to deal with pachucos, you know, it's quite a contrast there. But so I guess in a sense I was kind of an outsider, or this group was kind of an outsider. But it was just a very weird school. You didn't get any support from the teachers. And the people there were just there to, you know, to hang out, basically.
Was there did you consider that to be an educational environment at all? I mean, was it a very good educational environment then?
Oh, it was terrible. I mean, most of the emphasis was on, there wasn't well, you would have teachers that would do nothing except sit at their desk and read their newspaper. As long as you kept quiet, that was okay. It was fine. You didn't have to do anything. There was a handful of teachers that were stimulating. One of them works for HISD, as a matter of fact. I think his name is Juan Vela. He used to teach world history. He was one of the few teachers who was truly interested in teaching and motivating people. And he had a good subject, you know, so that may have helped. And then I had another teacher that sort of encouraged my journalistic instincts, you know, and I would write these outrageous stories about the school. I mean, just running everything down, the usual adolescent kind of stuff, and he would just love it, you know. He'd read it out in class and stuff because he thought it was so great that I was running the school down, you know. So every now and then you would run across...
Who was that?
Now that man, I can't remember his name. I wish I could.
Chicano or...
No, he was a white guy. Then I had another English teacher who was just a piss. And I used to really love English for some reason. I used to love to dissect sentences, you know. Sure. And but this guy was just a total asshole. And for some reason really hated me. I don't know, it was real strange. One day he called Alex out and told him he didn't want him to sit next to me anymore because I was a satanic influence on him or something like that. You know?
You and Alex were friends already in junior high school.
Oh yeah, well he lived next door to me.
Oh,
so we basically, I'm not sure if we went through elementary or not. I think we did go through a little part of elementary together. So we knew each other for quite a long time, yeah. But yeah.
And then you went on to Reagan High School, you said?
Then I went to Reagan because there were death threats already. You know, I mean, there were already people saying, you know, they're waiting for you to come to Davis, you know, because I was just such an oddball by their standards. So I decided to go to Reagan because it was close, and you know, it wasn't much further than Jeff Davis. In fact, about the same. And at that time, they had this freedom of choice business going. So I decided to go to Reagan, which was it was a good experience actually. There were maybe a dozen Chicanos there. There were maybe 3 or 4 blacks at that time. I mean, it was primarily a white, working class school. But the people were not hostile toward us, or toward me anyway. Again, I kind of developed this oddball persona of kind of the militant, whatever, you know, with the army jacket and the peace symbols and all that kind of stuff. And they got off to that. Plus, it was a time where drugs were starting to come into the schools. I mean, people would sit at their desks and just sort of fall out, you know, stuff. So it was kind of a rebellious time, and you know, and I got involved again with journalism pretty heavily at that time.
Did you work on the student newspaper?
Yeah. In fact, one issue I did the entire thing. But she would not let me be the editor. She refused to let me be the editor.
The student, the teacher, the sponsoring teacher, whatever.
Who was a great teacher actually, and I mean, we used to fight all the time because she didn't like. I mean, she liked what I wrote, but she couldn't publish it, and so I would always have to do 2 of everything, you know, kind of attitude. Because it was just an adolescent thing to want to get all this frustration out and just criticize, you know.
Were you a good student?
Yeah, I was fairly good. You know, I managed to keep up an A or a B, kind of average. I had trouble with the administration, because, you know, they would, this is in the days when they would run you through and check your hair once a month, you know, really stupid things like that. So I would have to go home at least once a month, get my hair trimmed or whatever. And then one time when they threatened to kick me out for, I think this was my senior year, as a matter of fact, I was distributing a petition on campus at the cafeteria to get more freedom for the newspaper, because we had no control, no say. You know, and I had written this article about the state of the statesman, as I call it, talking about the fact that there was no free speech in this school. Everything was, you know. And so I got run up to the principals for that petition, and in the process of this, he pulls out a file on me, and he says, you know, we know what you've been up to already. And he pulled out these leaflets that I had been distributing the summer before at Herman Park for SDS, you know. Actually, we had an organization called SUDS at that time, which was Student Union for Democratic Society, and it was a high school version of SDS. And we were one of the first, if not the first, to put the SUDS in the Meekum Fountain.
Well, who did you help organize the group, or?
Well, in a sense, yes, because there were only a handful of us.
Who was on?
It was me and Alex, and then some other people whose names I can't even remember anymore.
Anglos and Chicanos, or?
It was Alex and I were the only two Chicanos, and the others were Anglos. Yeah. So I mean, that was really the only radical activity at that time. You know, we're talking '67 and on up, and I really don't know how we got involved with these people. Probably by hanging out at the park or something. This was the day of the, what were they called, love-ins and stuff, where people would just sort of hang out at the park and stuff. And I guess that's where we met them, you know, because, and I remember going to meetings and stuff out in West University, and I'm thinking, how did this Chicano from the north side, this teenager, end up in West University and with these old-time Trotskys and God knows what else, you know? It just sort of happened, you know. I mean, there was a definite core of old, middle-class kind of radicals in Houston at that time.
Do you remember any of those names? Do you remember any of the older people that you were influenced by?
Well, not the older ones, actually. It was mostly through Space City News, and I remember Thorne Dryer's parents were very active. They used to have a gallery, and but I don't remember their names, to tell you the truth. There were a couple of people like that, and some of them have gone on to, I mean, they're involved. Well, those are the people who started Texas Monthly, for example. There were a couple of people there. But it was sort of an academic kind of attitude, you know, this kind of little clique of people in Houston. And we were just...
Was Bill Broyles part of that, or did he come along after that? He helped, I think he helped found Texas Monthly, didn't he?
Yeah, I think so. You don't remember? I don't remember, actually. There were, you know, I mean, there was so much stuff going on, so many people, and I'm afraid I'm not very good at names and stuff. So, but most of our activities sort of came out of Space City, more or less. And then there were other groups that were starting to develop, you know, more radical type groups. And there was that faction from the Yippies people. They were called. What the hell were they called? The point is, they were considered more responsible, you know, and that was the group that we sort of got ourselves involved in. Again, it was really more a question of wanting to go to Chicago and just wanting to do something different, you know, that we hadn't really done before.
So he ended up going to Chicago then.
Went to Chicago.
What was the circumstances of that now?
Well, that was right after the Democratic Convention, and it was just a series of demonstrations that were organized by all these different leftist groups, you know, the Yippies and on, and the Black Panthers. Oh, I know, I think there was some killing of one of the Black Panthers or something up there at that time. So these demonstrations were organized to sort of support that, and Daley was in power, obviously, at the time. So, you know, there was, I mean, they overreacted to everything. I mean, a simple demonstration would end up being tear gassed, regardless of whether there was any move on the demonstrators' part or not. So it was just that kind of a scene, you know, and I think we were there maybe 3 or 4 days. It was great.
It was you and Alex who went out there?
Alex and I, yeah. We went on, it was an old school bus. I remember we broke down, like, I mean, we could see Austin in the horizon at night, but, you know, we couldn't go any further because the bus broke down. And it was a very difficult trip, needless to say. You know, I think as a result of that...
Who organized it? I mean, was it a group of people here in town?
It was SDS.
SDS.
Yeah. And again, the SDS was being broken off into different factions at that point. And yeah, and we just got.
Well, was Bob Cash? You know Bob Cash. Was he part of that at the time?
Oh yeah.
He was there. Yeah.
He was there. Yeah.
So y'all went up there and you stayed how long in Chicago?
Oh, maybe 3 or 4 days, something like that. Maybe not that long. It was a few days.
Was that tremendously influential on you or not? What?
I think so. It really, it was a scary experience, you know, because you didn't know whether you were going to end up in jail or whether somebody was going to beat you up or you know, what was going to happen. And there was a lot of armed struggle talk at that time, and that was kind of a drag because it really put a tense, you know, it really made the thing tense. You know, we weren't, I don't think I was prepared at that point to pick up a gun kind of attitude, you know. But we were associating with people who were, so it was pretty scary. But yeah, it definitely had an impact on me, and it had an impact on how other people perceived us too, apparently. After we came back, we were like the local radicals, you know, kind of thing. But it was also a very positive experience, I thought, you know, because we did it, you know, and that was part of the thing, was just do something, you know, not to be afraid. I think that's been the problem with a lot of people and a lot of movements. People are afraid, either for economic reasons or health, you know, personal, you know, they're going to be killed or thrown in jail, all these kinds of things. When you're young, you try not to think about that, you just sort of do it. And but I was sort of conscious of it even then when I was young, you know, I mean, and I've always been conscious of it, but it's never really stopped me, you know. But I think it's given me or gave me a little bit of control, because we did some things in MAYO that were pretty crazy, and only one that I truly regret, which involved weapons and things. Nothing happened, thank goodness, but the fact that we put ourselves in that position was really, you know, really bad. That was the only time that I sort of let my machismo take over, and it was really pride kind of thing, ego more than anything else. But I think that's what that thing taught me, is that yeah, it is scary, but you have to do it anyway, you know.
Well, y'all went to Chicago, came back. Were you and Alex the only Chicanos in that group going up to Chicago?
From Houston, yeah.
Yeah.
There were Puerto Ricans and people like that up there, you know.
Yeah.
But no, yeah, we were it, you know.
So you came back and you were getting into, you got in, did you have any activity, get involved in anything between the time that you were at the Chicago situation and MAYO? Was there anything in between that?
No. We sort of wallowed in our glory, as it were.
Were you a member of SDS at that time?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, we were and we weren't. We associated with those people, and but we always maintained a certain distance from it, in the sense that we felt that as Chicanos we really had no place there. So we always felt a little bit removed from them, even though they were great people and they were our friends at that time and stuff. And I think they kind of respected that as well, that we didn't really want to be part of SDS because it was primarily a white middle-class organization. You know, even though it was radical, it was still not. It didn't have the ethnic part that you know, that sort of justified it for us, in a sense, our involvement, you know. And so we always maintained that we really weren't a part of it, but we were with them, kind of thing, you know. And sort of in the hopes that something, either we would start something or something would come out. They were kind of encouraging us also, the Space City people and the SDS people, to sort of start our own thing, you know. You know, they wanted us to sort of go out into the Chicano community and organize. They didn't say it in so many words, but that was the feeling we got, you know, and which was good. That's what we wanted to do as well. So we never really officially, I would say, joined them, even though we were involved with them and so on, you know. We always maintained a little bit of distance from it.
Now, my understanding, and correct me if any of this is incorrect, my understanding is that there was already an active MAYO group in town by the time you actually joined the group. Is that so?
Oh yeah, they were already in existence. These were the so-called community MAYO, you know. And
what was that? Was it called community MAYO? I've seen about.
We called ourselves MAYO, and we didn't even know so-called University of Houston MAYO existed until they gave us a phone call and said, "Hey, you know, we're out here, and why don't you come and talk to us?" So I don't know how they got started or who started them or anything else. I mean, you'd have to talk to somebody from that to figure out how they came to be.
The people at the University
People at the University of Houston, you know, we had some connections with them that we would go out there and speak to them, you know, and occasionally one or two of them would come down, you know, to the Valley and check it out or whatever. Which is kind of ironic because all those people were from the Valley. It's not like we were asking them to do something unusual, you know, but they did like the ivory tower kind of attitude. But there was already a MAYO in existence in Houston, and it was basically the people who started that were people like Poncho Ruiz and some of his friends from the Valley, people from the Valley who came up to Houston as part of the great boycott thing, and got involved with MAYO because that was starting to happen in Crystal City with Jose Angel and the school board there and the walkout and all that stuff. And so they started MAYO here in Houston, which is the so-called community MAYO. But they weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of, you know, trying to get some kind of a boycott organized of Jeff Davis having to do with Cinco de Mayo or September 16th, some holiday kind of thing. But they really weren't moving. I mean, there was too much bullshit going on, basically. There was too much... Well, it was a brand new organization. I guess you know, the rules would change weekly or daily. I mean, one week you had this kind of structure, the next week you had that kind of structure. One week so-and-so was president, the next week so-and-so was president. I mean, we just kept going like this. It was real weird. You know, one week Poncho was in control, then Benito Maldonado was in control, then Carlos Cadillo was in control. They were just kind of floating around like that, you know, as I understand. And
who was doing it when you got in there? Who were the actors and players?
I would say the major people were those three that I mentioned, which was Poncho Ruiz and Benito Maldonado. And Benito was kind of weird. He would sort of pop his head in there and you know, with a stack of books or something. And he was hard to figure out, you know. And frankly, not too many people trusted him. And Carlos Cadillo, who was even crazier then, if you can imagine. I don't know if you know Carlos. Yeah. And there were some other people. There was a handful of women that were involved also. They were mostly cousins of Poncho and stuff.
Who were they? Do you remember the
Well,
names?
one of the women's name was Tencha, and I can't remember her name, her last name. And a couple of other people like that. And there were a bunch of neighborhood kids, you know, some of them from Marshall, some of them from Davis or whatever. And there was also a group of, there was a Vista worker there who had a group of delinquents, pachucos, whatever you want to call them. And so some of those people would get involved off and on.
Do you remember the Vista person? Who was that?
Her name I can't remember. She was around for quite a while.
But it was a woman.
Yeah, it was a woman. And I can't remember her name, to tell you the truth.
Do you remember about what year? You say on dates you're not real clear, but about what year did you become involved? Did you move in?
Yeah, I would say it was like 69 or 70, something like that. And again, we found out that MAYO was, we'd have been hearing little things about MAYO, things going on in the Valley and stuff. And so Alex and I decided to check it out. We saw the big, you know, boycott grapes sign or something outside. It was an old gas station that was next door to Jeff Davis High School. It's no longer there. And
on Quitman there? Or
yeah, right there on the corner. Okay. And so it was a great location. So we just walked in one day and just talked to people. I think Poncho was the first person we talked to, or one of them. And he gave us the usual, you know, pep talk, whatever, and said, oh, sounds good, you know, well, we'll come back. So we just kind of hung around for a few days and sort of checked it out, and finally we were allowed to attend one of the meetings and all this kind of stuff. And we pretty much figured out what the structure was and how things were operating, and like I said, it was bouncing around. There was no control here. And Poncho kept yelling about security this and security that, you know. And I mean, I know that MAYO was infiltrated the entire time that it existed. And we have a very simple policy, which is we'll do everything out in the open. You know, we have no conspiracies here. So, you know, what you see is exactly what exists. So that was our defense in a sense. Mm-hmm. But and Yolanda Birdwell was there at that time too, with her husband Walter. And
they were there by the time you got in.
Yeah, they were already there. And but supposedly someone had pointed them out to us. Someone had pointed us out to them as having been with SDS or something. So she was kind of moving toward us as well. because I think people were trying to find people that had similar ideas and similar kinds of attitudes about what they wanted to do. Because this, like I said, MAYO was pretty much stagnated at this point. You know, they were passing out leaflets, but that was about it. There was no action here. There was no leadership. And so I sort of picked up on Yolanda and Walter because she was different. She stuck out like a sore thumb. What can I say? You know, here is this very Mexican-like, almost bourgeois-looking woman in the middle of all these, you know, crazies from the north side. You know, in her perfect Spanish, with her broken English, and she just had an image that I thought was very interesting and it could be very useful. You know. And so Alex and I kind of sort of concocted this conspiracy. Now you're going to get the official conspiracy. Only Alex and I know this. We decided, hell, we can take over that group without any problems. You know, it's easy. And so we sort of used sexism as a way of forcing these people to deal with issues that went beyond what they were dealing with at this point. And so we came up with the idea that in order to deal with this problem, that at all times MAYO would have a man and a woman represented as spokespersons or whatever. That way there would never be any question about, you know, the sexism issue. You know, and this is something that the state MAYO people really hated about us, is that we would always bring up the women's issue, and that would really just gripe them. You know, they still couldn't deal with that. But we essentially just kind of put together this thing. We got a bunch of Alex's brothers and sisters and a bunch of friends from the neighborhood and stuff that we knew, and we packed the meeting because anybody could vote.
Let's repeat that,
Okay.
Gregorio, the business about who was elected and whatnot.
Yolanda Berto was elected spokesperson along with myself. And again, this idea of having a man and a woman at all times is the official representatives. Spokesperson implies that all we did was go to the press conferences or whatever, but it's
Was there a president or a what?
No. We essentially wanted to have more of a collective decision-making kind of structure. But I think leadership sort of develops on its own, and so some people may have more influence simply because they have stronger leadership abilities or whatever. So what essentially developed is we had what Poncho loved to call a hardcore, you know. And that hardcore was basically Yolanda, myself. Walter was excluded because he was white at this time. Later things changed, and we said, you know, screw that, that's stupid, that's racism, just like everything else. And Poncho, of course, and Alex, and then we started bringing in other people. There was a guy named Peabody, I don't remember his last name, and Memo de la Cerda, towards the end, was another one of those people. And we started bringing in a lot of women, very strong women, who were also like Gloria Guardiola and Josie Perez? Yeah, and Yolanda Flores, that's her sister. People like that who gave it kind of a different direction. They were I don't know if they were older in years, but they were more mature. They weren't quite as crazy as we were, and that kind of gave it a little bit of a balance, you know.
Did the old group that had started MAYO there, did they continue to function within MAYO? What?
They were some of these so-called brown berets, for one thing. You know, this fictitious group of people that I never really knew what they were up to. You know, we would hear about them as they hung out upstairs.
What do you mean by
Well,
that?
they just sort of hung out up there, and we would hear about the brown berets, or, you know, here and all that kind of shit. But
Were they there? I mean, who was in the brown? Who were in the
I
brown?
don't know. I didn't care about the brown berets. I thought the whole thing was ridiculous because they never did anything. You know, they never showed up for anything. But you would always hear about the militant brown berets. You know, but it's like I operate.
Were there any names associated with them at all at that time?
Excuse me, Poncho would probably be the person who
Okay.
could tell you all of that. I didn't know them, and I wasn't interested. You know, I mean, that sort of got me in trouble later for being elitist, as they put it, because I had an agenda, and I really didn't care about all this other stuff.
And what was your agenda? I mean,
Well, I wanted to raise the level of political consciousness within the community. You know, I wanted people to. I wasn't necessarily trying to turn them all into a bunch of Marxists, but I wanted them to at least have enough motivation that they would take care of their problems and not be afraid to do so. People were very timid in those days. They're not quite as timid anymore. That's one good thing. But I mean, this whole kind of humility image of the Mexican, the poor, quiet Mexican, was really real at that time. And that really, that really got to me. I just hated the idea that people were so passive. And so my agenda was basically to stir people up.
Did you have a Marxist, did you approach things from a Marxist perspective? Did you have that well defined of an ideology at all? Or?
Yes and no. I think when you're dealing with things like picking up the trash, Marxism is not that relevant. If you're dealing with, let's say you're attending a conference or something and you're putting out position papers and this kind of stuff, then I would tend to become more sort of, by the line kind of thing. But in dealing with everyday problems and stuff, it really wasn't an issue for me, I mean, I guess I did have a political philosophy even then because I was involved with SDS, and so I was aware of all that. And I basically supported that point of view. And I don't know how realistic I was about it in terms of how valid that was for the Chicano community at that time and stuff. I mean, what I'm trying to get at is I don't know whether I was dogmatic about it or not. I guess only other people could sort of judge that. But I would say that, yeah, I did have a point of view. But again, I wasn't necessarily interested in forcing it on other people. I wanted to make things happen. And I felt this was my personal philosophy. And I wasn't out there to sort of, proselytize myself or whatever. That wasn't the issue for me. Because most people didn't want to deal with that issue still. It was still too hot to deal with. No matter how oppressed they are, they're still identified with this country and its system, So it was hard to kind of just blurt that out, which is what I ended up doing, But
hard to get away from that once.
Yeah.
You said that this office that the MAYO had, they had a desk somewhere with somebody else. Who was the other? The Great Boycotters?
The Great Boycott people, yeah.
Who was affiliated with the Great Boycott then? Do you remember any of the individuals?
Well,
involved?
Benito was one of the main ones, actually. Benito Maldonado. And some nuns, Bishop Flores, who was Father Flores at the time. They also had an office. Well, I think the office kind of went back and forth. I'm not sure whether they had two offices or whether at one time it was at one place. But at one time it was at St. Joseph's Church. There was one man in particular from Hidalgo County or whatever who was in charge of the whole thing, and I don't know his name.
But you and Alex, at least in your minds, pretty much engineered sort of pointing MAYO in a more focused direction.
Well, in what we felt was a more radical kind of direction. Now, it would have been easy enough for Poncho or the other group, other factions or whatever, to take it back. I mean, we were just two guys basically, because those kids didn't show up every time.
Right.
So it would have been easy enough for them to change it back. But I think partly due to the fact that we kind of developed our own little core, which was Yolanda, Walter, Alex, myself. We were able to sort of hold tight, the whole thing, and like again, because the church building takeover, whatever, came up so quickly right after we sort of did this. Once that incident occurred, that was it. We were in. That was. I mean, it's like World War II. Once it starts, you're not going to elect another president. That kind of attitude.
And you and Yolanda were the two spokespeople by that time.
Right. And the theory was that she would do it in Spanish and I would do it in English. But she was doing it in English as well. It worked really well, not so much in press conferences, but it worked really well from rallies and meetings and things of that sort, where there were people from the community who either didn't speak English or would prefer to speak Spanish, whatever. And it was something new also within the Chicano movement, at least around here, because the whole language problem was a big issue. You know, the fact that we did not speak English, did not speak Spanish and so on. Here was kind of a reversal of the problem. You know, Chicanos who don't speak Spanish rather than English. But it was sort of an ironic situation in that here we were victims of the system that had taken our language away, being criticized because we didn't speak Spanish, you know. And my defense was to have no defense and simply say, I don't have to justify any of this, you know. I mean, I grew up in this country, I was educated in this school system, and what do you expect me to speak, you know? It really was a hot issue, especially the people in the valley. I mean, they would always, you know, ram that down our throats. Yeah, and you're being raised in an environment, even though Spanish is being spoken, it's not the language you use in school. It's not necessarily good Spanish either, in the sense that it's correct or grammatically or whatever. It's not very sophisticated. The level of Spanish within the Chicano community, of people who speak it on an everyday basis, the vocabulary is pretty low. It's very basic stuff, you know. I couldn't have the discussion I'm having with you right now in Spanish. You know, it would take me too long to think about it and to say it, and it wouldn't come out the same way, you know. But I have no trouble communicating in Spanish. You know, I mean, there's a difference between just everyday talk, you know, and trying to carry on some kind of a discussion. And since I was dealing with that level of discussion in the rallies and so on, I mean, I was trying to be articulate, you know. I couldn't possibly have done it in Spanish, you know. But there was Yolanda there to fulfill that. Who could do it brilliantly. I mean, she was great, you know, when she was, rattled it right out, you know. It sounded fabulous. Made everything sound even more important, you know. It's a beautiful language, you know. I mean, and you really know how to use it. Otherwise, it just sounds stupid, you know.
So, this hardcore that Poncho refers to, y'all set the agenda once y'all got in there. Do you think so?
Yeah.
I mean, is that an overstatement there?
We were issue-oriented, you know. We would sort of move from issue to issue. If things would occur, then we would take a stand, we'd take an action. We were very spontaneous. We didn't necessarily debate a lot as to whether we should do this or not do this. Like, for example, we had an incident one time at the old Shamrock Hilton in the ballroom there, and there was somebody to do with, I think it was the president, this must have been Nixon, the president's committee on...
To re-elect or whatever.
Some bull, you know. It was a bunch of...
Creep.
It was basically a meeting or a gathering of Chicano Republicans, okay? And we weren't invited. So we decided we were going to attend anyway, you know, just kind of spontaneously. And we ended up disrupting the whole thing and jumping on tables and doing it. But that was it just happened, you know. And we were having a good time, you know.
You didn't go to do it, in other words.
We didn't go to do it, no. It just developed that way because we had a very short fuse. And essentially, if people didn't want to listen to us, wouldn't allow us to speak, try to keep us out, anything like that, we would react like children in a sense, you know. Right on the spot, we said, you know, you're not going to get away with this, you know. And we would just force our way in and do whatever we wanted to do. Because, like I said, we had a bunch of kids with us, you know, essentially, teenagers. And, I mean, there was all this energy there anyway, and they weren't afraid of anything, you know. And things would just sort of happen. And I don't remember whether I was trying to make it happen or I don't think I tried to prevent it, but I don't know whether I was always thrilled about what was happening. You know, sometimes it was like the thing would get out of hand. And once it got out of hand, the only choice was to jump into it, you know, just go along with it. And hope it didn't get too out of hand, you know. So there wasn't a lot of conspiratorial stuff going on. Like I said, you know, we were pretty upfront about what we were going to do, even if it was an illegal act, you know. We would hope that the media was very helpful in the sense of protecting us, you know. It just kind of gave us, because people wanted to know what was going on, so if one of us got beaten up or something by the police, we'd have a forum already waiting for us, you know. So I think they were kind of cautious of that sort of thing, and because they could have been rougher. They could have, like, they treated the John Brown Revolutionary League people, or what's the name of the Black Panther group here?
The People's Party.
People's Party. I mean, they went after them, you know, and they destroyed them.
Did they ever, and this is something general did they ever actually beat y'all up?
Well, they sort of beat us up at the school board thing, you know, but that was because they were chasing us and were trying to stop us. I do remember being kicked, though. But it wasn't anything serious. I don't.
Compared to what they did to the other
Yeah.
leftist
Yeah.
groups. Let's go back and let's start with the takeover of the
Juan Marcos.
Marcos. You say MAYO had been thinking about that, had been negotiating that to begin with.
Yeah, this has been going on for, I don't know if it was months or a year or something, but for some time. And there was, because this building was empty and it was in a very good location for a community center or something, you know. And it was abandoned by the white congregation because the neighborhood was just too poor and too Mexican for them, I suppose. So apparently people like Benito and so on have been negotiating to try and have something happen there, you know. And nothing was happening. They were just stalling. And some of this was being done through the Metropolitan Ministries, which is like a liberal organization of the Presbytery. And so anyways, when all this came up, we kind of, you know, says, well, you know, we've got this situation here and nothing is happening, you know. It's just stagnant and nothing's going to happen. So someone says, well, no, let's take it over. That's when takeovers were very popular, as they say. You know, the Black Panthers
You
would take it.
say someone said, do you remember, was there a particular someone or was it just sort of a spontaneous?
I don't know who said it, to tell you the truth. I mean, it could have been...
It was not your particular idea.
I don't know. I really don't remember, you know. I mean, somebody said, let's take it over, you know. And like I said, that was happening all in California and stuff. And,
Sure.
and so it's just a big thing, you know, take over buildings. And it kind of clicked like, well, you know, that's not such a bad idea, you know. It kind of put us into a better level here because we hadn't done anything, you know. There had been some little things before that which I can't even remember.
I noticed that, you know, seemed to be a series of events beginning with this, with the takeover.
Yeah, there were.
You don't, but there had been a few before.
There were some things, yeah. But they were mostly like attempts to organize boycotts and attending certain meetings and that kind of thing. You know, there was no real action, and there may have been some pickets that were organized. You know, things like that had happened, and mostly in relation to the Great Boycott, actually. But there really wasn't anything militant per se, you know, that was sort of identified as having that quality about it. But so we just kind of, you know, decided, well, we're going to negotiate on this thing, but we're going to negotiate on a different level now. We're going to negotiate with the threat of a takeover, you know.
Which brings up a point. This came up at a meeting. Did y'all have regular meetings? How often were y'all's meetings of MAYO?
They did have regular meetings, or attempted to have regular meetings, but meetings were actually, again, spur of the moment, depending on what was happening. It was a very tight group of people. We saw each other daily. You know, I mean, we were always together, it seemed like. So we were always talking to one another. When we would have a meeting, it was to formalize something, a decision, you know, so that people could report about fundraising activities and that kind of thing. But we were always together, you know, pretty much. Everybody, not just the so-called hardcore. The so-called hardcore would occasionally get together to have these kind of high-level meetings where we would decide things, you know. But the decision to take over the building, that just happened spontaneously, too. I mean, the final, yes, we're going to do it. And we were basically, again, short fused, you know. We were pushed into it. And again, I don't know how much of this is just machismo or whether it was the thing to do at the moment, but like I said, we decided we were going to negotiate, but with a little more emphasis on the possibility of a takeover. We just sort of let that out. You know, the Mayos are talking about taking over, because we had all kinds of people who could sort of pass the word, Lionel Castillo, for example. And other individuals who were not part of the organization but supported what we were trying to do, and they would sort of filter the information.
Was Lionel supportive, do you think?
Oh yeah, he was definitely. I don't know if I should say this, but hell, it's been years ago. Yeah, he was. I mean, he would come and visit us almost on a nightly basis to see how things were happening, and I'm sure he had something to do with sort of keeping the police back and stuff. You know, I mean, in some ways. He helped us all along. He helped us during the school boycott thing when we were arrested. Afterwards, he helped me personally when I blurted out that I was a communist and sort of defended me to the community kind of thing. So, he's been in there all the time, backing us up and stuff. So, I mean, he's a very good friend of mine, just because I have all these specifics about things that he did, But I just sort of go off into all these different directions.
No, that's very pertinent, actually.
The thing is, so we started negotiating again with the Presbyterian Church, and but then they introduced a very interesting element. They said, well, there's this Mexican congregation out here in is this Second Ward, or what is this area out here by Houston Avenue and Washington?
Oh, Sixth Ward.
Sixth Ward, okay. There was a congregation, which is now Juan Marcos Presbytery. That's the name of the building now. They had a crummy old wooden building out there. And again, they were anxious to get out of there for two reasons, I thought. One was the building was old and needed to be torn down. And the other one was that their area was becoming black. And they didn't particularly care for that, even though they were Christians. So, anyways, they wanted to get out. And so the Presbytery, or the Presbyterian Church, offered them this building. They said, well, we've got a building over here you can have, kind of thing. So now, all of a sudden, we're not fighting with the Presbyterian diocese. No, we're fighting with some other Chicanos. It was a very clever little maneuver on their part. So we said, okay, fine. We don't care who occupies it, as long as something is going on. If this congregation is willing to set up, some kind of programs to deal with the community issues and so on, that's fine. Because we weren't interested in running breakfast programs and all this other stuff. I mean, that would just bog us down, but we wanted somebody to do it, So we started negotiating with them at this point. We attended this meeting at their church, and I don't know what was said or what the deal was, but I just blew my stack. And I just became totally emotional. I started yelling and cussing. And when I started cussing, that's when they just flipped out. I mean, they couldn't handle it, It's like I had violated the sanctity of their sanctum or whatever,
This was the Chicano Presbyterian Church.
Right. But it wasn't actually in the chapel. It was in one of the meeting rooms,
Okay.
So, not that it would have made any difference, quite frankly. But that blew them away. They couldn't handle that. And we just stormed out of there. We said, that's it. We're tired of talking about this thing. We just stormed out, went outside, and on the spot, outside the church, decided right then and there, all right, are we going to take it over or not? Everybody, let's take it over, let's take it over. All right, we'll do it tomorrow. That was it. We went home, and we said, all right, we'll be there at 9 o'clock or whatever the hell it was. And we just met in front of that building, and I forget who, but we used Alex's cane. I remember Alex used to carry a cane around all the time. We just kind of poked a little hole in the window, one of the bathrooms, flipped the thing open. I think Juan Edgar went in. Juan Edgar was Joanna Birdwell's son. We pushed him through there, and he opened the door, and we were in. We called the press, we called the Presbytery, let them know we were in, and called the press, called the community, and then we started bringing community people in as quickly as we could, because we didn't know what was going to happen. We were sort of semi-barricaded ourselves, but at the same time, we wanted to have a flow of people from the community as protection.
Who was involved in this? Do you remember the characters?
That was Yolanda and Walter, of course, and Poncho, and Peabody, and Memo, and Virgie. What was her last name? She was great.
Isn't it Martinez? Was it
Virgie Martinez?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then there were lots of people from the community. There was Gloria, who later became Alex's ex-wife, as it turned out. Gloria, I don't know her name. It used to be Gloria Rodriguez at one time. And she was a teacher, school teacher. She was a white school teacher. And she was very good in that, I forget exactly what her connection was, but she had something to do with the people at Irvington Village, the housing project that's right down the street. And we got a lot of people from there involved, which was really good.
The newspaper said that y'all were leading a coalition of organizations that did that. Was that true? I read that in the newspaper.
There was no coalition of organizations. There was just us, a handful of adults, most of us in like our early 20s, and a bunch of kids. That was the whole thing. But once we did get in, we did bring in people from the community.
I see.
I mean, that was the key to keeping it, in a sense. Both from the housing project and from the immediate neighborhood.
Okay.
People like Mrs. Hernandez, for example, who was involved. She was just one of the women from the neighborhood. people would cook for us and da-da-da. I mean, they set up the breakfast program, essentially. I mean, these women from the community were the ones who were doing the cooking, and I guess
So y'all had real strong support from...
Oh, yeah, definitely from the community, absolutely, yeah. And we had a breakfast, like within a couple of days. We didn't, once we felt that we were not going to be thrown out by the police, we set up a breakfast program, and we set up a breakfast program, and we had a lot of senior citizen kind of stuff going on and whatever. The main thing was the breakfast program. That was sort of the...
For kids or for average person?
For kids, but I mean, it really didn't matter. If you were hungry, you could eat there. It wasn't. We didn't have any rules or anything. And I think that money came from the Unitarians, actually, Unitarian Church, or because we got involved with another organization called the Unitarian Universalist Committee or something, and they helped fund the later center that we established in the north side, a little bit different location, but same general area. But I think they were the only ones who were giving us money for the breakfast program. Other than that, we really had no source of income of any sort. I mean, there was no money coming in for these projects and stuff. We didn't need much. We get most things donated for whatever we were doing. So I guess that lasted, what, 2-3 weeks, something like that, And the San Antonio people, which was like the state headquarters for MAYO, and La Raza Unida and all that stuff, they weren't too thrilled.
They weren't?
Oh, no, they were very uptight, actually, about the whole thing at first. And then when they saw the PR coming out of it and so on and so forth, then they were a little nicer to us about it. But they never really liked the things we did. See, the basic difference is that we were an urban group and they were not. Even people in San Antonio didn't really practice urban politics in the way that we wanted to. I mean, the idea of taking over buildings, and although they had done things similar, they took over the mission down in the valley at one point, but that didn't work out too well, I mean, they had some serious problems with the police and stuff.
How did y'all? What kind of interaction did y'all have with the police while y'all were taking over the building? Didn't they come in? Of course, it would have been up to the presbytery to come in and evict y'all.
They were there. They were outside. I mean, they weren't. There was always a squad car or something. I mean, they weren't there en masse or anything, and. Yeah, it was up to the presbytery. We were having meetings with them all the time, I mean, down there, or they were coming down here to meet with the community and have people scream at them, We'd go back and forth with this sort of stuff. And at one point, we invaded the First Presbyterian Church. That was great.
That came about a month later, didn't it? When y'all.
We were already out? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, I think.
They cut that from, apparently they were broadcasting at the time. You know how they broadcast religious services. And
it was after y'all were evicted, were y'all were evicted from the church finally. What happened there?
Well, I think we sort of felt we had reached the point where nothing positive was going to come out of us sort of resisting the whole thing. We had been given some more or less assurances that Juan Marcos would in fact establish some community programs. I think what had happened, we sort of rationalized it by saying, well, we have forced these people to deal with the fact that they exist in a poor community and that there are problems here, and we have forced the presbytery to come up with some money, hopefully, for programs, and we just had to wait and see. I mean, we had more or less had their word on it, but that didn't mean anything. So I guess that was the only thing we could sort of, say was, hopefully Juan Marcos will do something now that all this pressure has been put on them, and that is in fact what has happened. That church does have community programs right now. But at that point, we didn't see the justification in getting our heads, broken for no reason. So we said, okay, fine, take it back.
And y'all left.
We got out. Plus, we had another center by then. So
y'all had another center.
We had already established. We established a Northside People's Center, which was in the same area more or less, and that was funded through the Unitarian Universalist Committee.
Where was that? Do you remember the address?
Oh God. Well, I'll tell you the location of it more or less. It was in this little area between like Main Street and Quitman, and that around Casa de Amigos, but a little bit further in.
Now, y'all had my geography's a little off here. Y'all had a headquarters on Brook Street, didn't you?
Yeah, there was another, that was
a different thing.
the last one. Are we talking about, like, was that the time? I think that's the same. It's also called Northside People's Center.
Okay.
And that was the next building we had. That was a different thing altogether. By then, I had pretty much discredited the organization with my statement about being a communist, and I'd already been to Cuba, and people were upset about that.
Did you feel that you were...
Somebody else was in charge of that center is what I'm getting at. I think Yolanda Flores was the director at that point. I was sort of like a hanger-on. They allowed me to stay at the center and work out of the center and that kind of thing. But it was really her group by this point. I mean, MAYO didn't really exist. We tried to keep it going, but it just didn't seem to want to work anymore. I think in some ways that people had gotten too sophisticated for their own good, and there was too much backstabbing and ideological bullshit going on. And I mean, ideology was not really an issue originally. I mean, I didn't try to push it down people's throats. But toward the end, it became very factionalized. Between people thinking we were too extreme, people thinking we weren't Marxist enough or Trotsky enough, or that kind of stupidity. And all these other organizations started happening at that time. People that I didn't know who they were. It's like all of a sudden there's all these other Chicano organizations. The Socialist Workers this, and and all this kind of stuff. And for the most part, as far as I was aware, these people had done no work in the community, and all of a sudden they're making demands on me specifically to make this statement or make that statement or make this apology or make that apology. It became like a big PR kind of thing. It's like, Gregorio's going to, deal with the problem by saying this. Well, who the hell cares what I had to say at that point? I mean, it wasn't up to me is what I'm getting at, And all these strange organizations started sort of popping up with all their own agendas to their political philosophy and what they think the community should be and not be, and that kind of thing. And I wanted nothing to do with it at that point. It was just like, and like I said, there was so much backstabbing going on. So the organization basically broke apart.
So y'all were evicted from. Y'all allowed yourself more or less to be evicted from.
Yeah, we left after we were told that we would be removed if we didn't leave. But I don't know whether we were prepared to resist them at any point, because we had no weapons. I mean, the only thing we could do is barricade the door and be dragged out, which I suppose is what we had planned on doing. Just laying down and having the police drag us out. But I guess we just figured at this point, we'd been in there long enough, we'd made our point, hopefully something good would come out of it, and so why spend a lot of time and money getting arrested, So we left, that was it.
The ladies that had provided the free breakfast and all that, they remained loyal to y'all?
Oh yeah, we just moved to the next center, It was not as convenient for them because it was a little bit more out of the way, but yeah, they came right along with us, We had quite a lot of community support, and just ordinary people who would show up at rallies or whatever,
One of the things that's always mentioned, at least I saw in my own research, and I saw mentioned, was the boycott against the Presbyterian Church, the First Presbyterian Church. That was out on Main Street, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right.
What are your recollections of that situation? Was this connected with the Juan Marcos, or was it after that?
I'm not really clear. I think in that material I gave you, there's a leaflet that explains what we were doing there.
Okay.
But I don't really remember whether it was directly tied in. It could have had something to do with the fact that they had made certain promises and weren't coming across, related to Juan Marcos or related to certain programs that we wanted the Presbyterian diocese or whatever to get involved in.
Was that also a spontaneous thing, or had y'all planned that out?
Well,
Do you remember that
I
book?
think we had sort of, again, we had sort of threatened them. That was our basic tactic. First we threaten, then we do, you know. And I think we had posted a note or something on the door, like the Sunday before, saying that if X isn't done, then we're going to, you know, do whatever, you know. And it just sort of worked out that particular demonstration was Easter Sunday. And it was being broadcast live and all this kind of stuff. And what was I going to say? I'm not too clear exactly how it happened, but I know that you know, there was a demonstration going on outside, and some of us decided that we had the right to go inside and worship, as it were, just to be there, you know. So I think it was probably Yolanda and myself and Poncho, whoever, and decided that we were going to go in, and they weren't going to allow that. Okay, so now the fact that we're being told we can't go into a church becomes an issue for us. And basically it was a spontaneous thing once again, where people just kind of forced their way in because they were told they couldn't come in. You know, we were quite willing to come in there, put down our signs, and sit down with them, you know, amongst them, as it were. I think we had discussed the idea that we wanted to go and sit with them, you know, sort of bring ourselves to them. And I think we were willing to put down our signs and stuff, but it didn't work out that way because we were placed into another confrontation with them. And so we basically just pushed our way in, and
They tried to stop you at
they
the
tried
door.
to physically stop us from entering the chapel. And
Pardon me.
so,
Okay, so you...
no, go ahead. Well, that was basically it, and we just disrupted the services, and they discontinued the televised broadcast, so it didn't come out, unfortunately. And then we got a restraining order, you know, basically. I mean, we have restraining orders all over Houston, places that theoretically I'm not allowed to be at.
The Presbyterian Church being
Presbyterian Church being one of them, Juan Marcos being one of them, First Presbyterian, Juan Marcos, the University of Houston, God, I don't know, just various places where we disrupted things, you know. But that was one of our basic tactics, was to disrupt. Not necessarily bring about any kind of violence or anything like that, but just to kind of make our point that we were not going to be pushed away, we were not going to be ignored, that they were going to be forced to listen to us. And you know, we could have been dealt with very easily if people had understood, you know, our basic motivation, which was that we insisted on being heard. And you know, because that was like a basic thing for us, the fact that for so many years, for centuries, that Chicanos had been just ignored. I mean, we weren't important enough to be listened to. And so it was like we refused to perpetuate this kind of inferiority complex. We also felt that this was a way of bringing up the awareness of the community, that they didn't have to take it either. They could speak up, you know, they should speak up, you know, that was the whole point. So
There was a newspaper editor who is a supporter of ours here, named Felix Ramirez, in the north side. Felix and Lena Ramirez.
I think I know who
They had the Compass newspaper back then.
Right, right.
Did they support y'all? Do you remember them at all from that era? Or?
I remember them vaguely, as they
Yeah.
say. I remember the newspaper actually quite well. It was real hard because there were lots of people who were either taking credit for MAYO or condemning MAYO at that time. People from the old Chicano establishment, you might say. The old there were people within the Chicano community who had been active in their own way, either by starting newspapers. There was, I can't remember his first name, but Gutierrez used to have a newspaper called El Yaqui or something. Mm-hmm. And he would always appear with the original MAYO flag at meetings. He'd say, look, here's the original flag, and la-di-da, you know. And we'd say, great. So there was a lot of people like that in the community, and like I said, they were either taking credit for us or blaming us, you know, saying that we were bad for the image of the community. We had a lot of resistance from within the community as well.
Do you remember any of the people or organizations that resisted y'all, that you know that you did feel some reservations from?
Yeah, well, I can't think of any specific individuals, but there were some. But mostly, I remember one particularly bad one, and that was Reverend Navarro who is, I don't know, he may be dead by now.
No, he's still alive.
Yeah, from El Sol. Well, he was very critical of Mayo. He just hated us. And I think he's Presbyterian, which I think was part of the reason. Baptist, even worse. He was one that was particularly vehemently opposed to us in our whole tactics. And then there were individuals within LULAC, for example, or some of the more established Chicano organizations. And I think they were afraid that we were stirring things up too much in the wrong way, and that this was going to backfire, and there was going to be even more resentment against the Chicano community or something. I'm not quite sure. I think basically we were just in conflict with them in terms of style and stuff, you know. And they were very threatened by this whole idea that there was any communist or any kind of ideological politics going on, you know, and that they would be branded as leftists and all that kind of stuff. But we got flack from them, and we just basically ignored it. I mean, what did we care what these old guys said? You know, I mean, it was that was basically our attitude. You know, you do your thing out there, and you know, that's fine, that's great. See, we never criticized anybody because their politics were not as radical as ours. We supported everyone in all efforts. I mean, that was our policy. You know, we saw no point in Chicanos fighting among Chicanos, which was like all they used to do at one point. And that to us was just stupid. And so, I mean, our basic philosophy was, you do what you want to do, and I'm sure it's going to have some positive effects, and we'll do what we want to do, and hopefully we'll have some positive effects. But they didn't see it that way. They saw us as a threat to whatever little power they thought they had, you know, I mean, because we were shaking it up for them, and they didn't like that. But again, it wasn't really a problem because we just ignored them. You know, they weren't relevant to what we were doing, you know. We just did what we wanted to do. Hopefully we would get some support from the community. But that doesn't mean that everybody in the community was supporting what MAYO was doing. You know, I'm sure there were people within that community who just hated the fact that you got all these crazy Mexicans raising hell, you know. Some people were very intimidated by us. That, you know, they felt physically threatened by our presence. Yet we never hit anyone. You know, we never actually did anything to anyone. It was all image, you know. They were afraid of the image. And we sort of played upon that, I guess. You know, we took advantage of it.
Speaking of image, how did y'all dress?
Well, badly, I suppose. It was all, you know, army with jackets and fatigues, and I think there were some berets in the bunch, not many. I kind of discouraged the berets. You know, I had this real bad spot for berets for some reason.
Why is that?
Because they were always talking about them as being this incredibly militant group, and yet they never appeared, you know. I mean, it was like a phantom organization. I just don't get it, you know. But they were very big in California at the time, as I recall.
The Brown Berets.
The Brown Berets, yeah. But again, a lot of it, they were pure image. I mean, they'd march up and down Wilshire Boulevard in their little pseudo-militaristic kind of attitude. I think what I resented about it also was that they did kind of have these military overtones in their style. And we were very much opposed to that kind of, I mean, we were, again, coming from a more progressive, I guess, attitude. One of the things that we got involved in was the anti-war movement, and that was because of the fact that, you know, I mean, you look at the statistics and you can see the disproportionate killings of minorities in the Vietnam War. I mean, when those kinds of issues were now starting to surface, you know, we were starting to get, again, broader in the terms of the issues that were relevant to us. You know, dealing with the draft in the Chicano community was a very difficult problem because most of them wanted to join, you know. I mean, Chicanos have the highest amount of of Medal of Honor winners in the entire country. I mean, that's incredible. So that became another, and again we approached it from the point of view of racism, and that didn't go over too well either. You know, I mean, it's like we never, we got some flack on that also. There was even an editorial in the Cougar of all things, the University of Houston Cougar, saying that, you know, we really shouldn't use these kind of tactics. You know, they're just working against us because we were bringing up these issues. You know, the fact that. And maybe my choice of words wasn't the best to go to a rally against the Vietnam War, where you've got primarily white middle-class kids, and start condemning white middle-class kids. You know, it wasn't their fault. You know, they weren't responsible for the war, but at the same time, there were issues that related to their class privilege. You know, and so that's where we would get into trouble. But and like I was going to say about the school boycott, the same thing there. The fact that we were telling Chicanos that they were guilty of racism. that they were motivated because they didn't want their kids going to school with black kids, and that was wrong. You know, they didn't go. That went over like a lead balloon. But point is, we said it anyway. You know, I mean, that was our philosophy. We didn't take instructions from other people. We dealt with the issues as we thought we should. You know, and if people didn't like it or they criticized us, well, that was irrelevant. You know, it really never bothered us, to tell you the truth. It may have bothered some people, but it never bothered me or Yolanda, for example. You know, we just kept on doing what we wanted to do. We figure at some point they're going to pull the plug, and that'll be it. You know, and up until then, we'll just do it the way we want to do it.
What do you mean, pull the plug?
Well, I mean, if there is no support there, you can't keep going. Then you just turn into a babbling idiot. You know, you're just talking and nobody's listening. But as long as there were people within the community, as long as the membership continued to support us, as long as there was somebody, you know, some prominent individual within the Chicano community who maybe not up front, but was at least willing to sort of tell us in the background, you know, yeah, I like what you're doing, keep it up. That was enough to keep us going, you know. We never expected to be like a mass membership organization or anything like that. We liked the fact that it was small. It was easier to control what we did, you know.
Which brings up a point. When y'all were, I would say, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but was 1970 the peak year of y'all's existence?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I would say so.
How many people are we talking about
Max?
In the group?
I would say 20, maybe 30 at a certain point. There was usually about 15 or 20 people actively involved. And then when things would get a little hot, maybe we'd go up to 30 or more. But then there was all this community kind of thing. And they weren't really part of the organization, but they would back up. They would show up for demonstrations, rallies, or whatever. But the people who were actually attending meetings and passing out leaflets, you know, actual membership, would vary between 15 and 30 or so people. You know, it was a small group.
And this other issue, again, I'm trying to bring this part of our interview have a closure on it right now, because of this appointment I've got to go. I know you've got places to go too, but this name business. In my research, I saw Inner City MAYO, Community MAYO, and Barrio MAYO. What was the name of the group as far as you knew it to be?
We called it MAYO. Now, you know, on our letterheads or whatever, we would have Mexican American Youth Organization. The inner city business, or Barrio MAYO, or Community MAYO, those were terms that I don't know if we came up with the term, or whether the University of Houston MAYO people came up with the term, or the press, or whatever. I really don't know whose idea that was. But it was a way to distinguish the people working in the community, basically the ones who were raising all the hell, from the people at the University of Houston. You know, they were involved in more traditional types of programs. They were setting up scholarships or whatever. And we had very little to do with one another in terms of direct actions. We were aware of one another's activities to some extent, not totally. You know, we would go and speak to their group about what we'd been doing, and occasionally some of their people would come down here to see what we were up to, and they would do things like they would try to help us raise money occasionally for specific projects and so on. So there was cooperation between us, but we were different as night and day. I mean, there was really no connection between us as far as activities. Again, they would support some of the things we would do, but beyond that, you know, they were coming from a whole different perspective on what they were trying to accomplish, and it just wasn't the same organization, you know.
Did y'all ever collaborate on any direct action at all? I had read somewhere, for example, that some of them were involved in the picketing of the Presbyterian Church. Do you remember them being there at all?
I don't remember them, but that doesn't mean they weren't.
Right.
You know, there were lots of things like that, and it could have been individuals that, because some individuals within that organization were more active and more militant as well. And then they had some real conservative types, you know, who just, you know, they were just very timid about the whole thing and didn't particularly like what we were doing. I kind of suspect that maybe, I don't know, that maybe the San Antonio people kind of set up U of H MAYO to sort of counteract us in a sense, you know, like try to divert attention away from us into a more respectable kind of group. That was also the beginnings of Raza Unida, you know, and that's a whole other story as well.
Right.
you know, we were not playing those politics. I mean, we were basically coming from an urban attitude, and you know, we were just a very excitable group.
Which brings up one more issue that I want to cover on today's interview. What was the average age of this 20 to 30 membership?
Well, I would say that, you know, I was about 19 or 20, and that was like, more or less, I would say the people in the so-called hardcore were in their 20s. And you're talking about a handful, 4 or 5 people. And the majority of the people were either high school or junior high school. So you're talking about people between 14 and 18 as being the majority of the membership.
So it's a very young organization.
Oh, yeah.
Was there any violence? Did anyone get struck during the thing?
Yeah, I think people were hit. But again, it was very fast. I mean, they were trying to club us, basically. I mean,
the police.
Yeah, they're there on these horses, and they're charging at you. I mean, people could very easily have been seriously hurt. There was no question about that possibility. And I think some people were, you know, knocked down or something like that, and then all the commotion. And but there weren't any serious injuries. I mean, nobody, as far as I know or remember, nobody bled, and nobody was seriously hurt. There was a lot of burning eyes and skin and so on from those people that were close enough to the tear gas. I think they must have shot just one or something, because there wasn't a lot, but there was some, and I think it was just an attempt to scare us, you know. But it was, I think the fact that they were on horseback kind of limited the amount of violence without it becoming really extreme on their part. So I think they sort of restrained themselves somewhat.
This was Sheriff's Department, seemed to be Sheriff's Department.
It was the Sheriff's Department, yeah. Of course, the cavalry or mounted horse or whatever they're called. Again, it was an overkill on their part, you know. I mean, they would have been much more effective if they hadn't been on those horses, because, well, like I said, it was potentially a very dangerous situation. And so, I mean, we were just lucky that nobody was seriously hurt. But people were hit. I mean, there was some physical violence used against us.
What about the Anglo crowd? Were they pretty hostile to y'all, or not? Do you remember anything?
I don't recall too much about that, but I think they were more intimidated by us than anything else. They obviously didn't want our presence there, but I think we kind of scared them a little bit, because they were afraid something would happen, which in fact it did. We weren't booed or anything like that, you know, by them or whatever, but you know, you could sense people are uptight and that they were somewhat afraid of us, I think, you know.
Which brings up a good point about police harassment. Looking back on those years, especially the 1970 period, 70 to 71, when you all were so intensely involved in that business, do you remember any episodes of police harassment? What are your recollections of that?
Well, we had a lot of visits from the FBI. I mean, that was like a routine. I don't know. I don't remember whether they came into the Presbyterian Church, but right after that, when we set up the Northside People Center, we would have these guys show up on a routine basis just to chat and see what we were up to. I mean, they were very casual about the whole thing. They'd show us their badge and stuff, you know. And I remember the first time they came, Yolanda Birdwell was there, and and this guy flashes his FBI badge, and you know, says, "I'm with the FBI, da da da," and Yolanda said something like, "That don't mean shit around here, man," you know. and see you later. We're not going to talk to you. I would get visits at home. I had somebody assigned to me who would come to the house periodically, and he'd want to talk to me, and he would always drop a little piece of information of something that I was doing, something beyond MAYO, you know, if I was registering in school or doing this or doing that. He would make a little comment, well, how's school coming, or how's this, or how's that, you know, just to let me know that they knew what I was up to overall, not just in MAYO, but everything else, you know. And it was, again, an attempt to scare people, to intimidate them. So the FBI was pretty active with us as far as just coming around and letting us know that they were around, and letting us know that they had information of our activities, whether political activities or just daily mundane kinds of things, you know. As far as the Houston police are concerned, other than at a confrontation situation, we weren't aware that they had infiltrated us or anything like that, or had them coming down to the center, for example, and trying to create problems for us or anything. It was mostly, you know, when we were in confrontation and like the school board incident, you know, where people were deliberately hit. You know, I mean, it wasn't necessary. They could have restrained us without hitting or kicking and that kind of thing. That was probably when they got the most physical, was at the school board.
Were you ever, you mentioned the business about not being aware, you were never aware of them infiltrating y'all? Did you ever suspect it?
We assumed that that somebody had infiltrated us, whether it was the police or the FBI or whoever. We just sort of took that as an assumption and tried not to worry about it too much. I knew a lot of organizations at that time spent all their time being paranoid and worrying about things and creating a very secretive atmosphere for themselves, which only turned out to backfire in the sense that the police then got real suspicious about what are they up to. They're being so secretive. We were always very upfront about everything we did. Our meetings were open to anybody. We never had a closed meeting. I mean, that was part of our policy. That was our security, we felt. The fact that whatever we do, even if it's an illegal activity, it's up front. Because, you know, in a sense, we didn't feel we were breaking the law. I mean, we knew we were breaking the law, but we didn't feel we were breaking the law. We felt justified in what we were doing. And again, the times were such that people were doing this sort of thing all over the country. And that kind of gave us a certain amount of confidence that even though we were going to violate the law, that we were justified and that we were morally correct in our stand. So with that in mind, we had no reservations about letting people know what we were up to. Like I said, sometimes like the San Jacinto thing, we would try to do them quickly so that there wouldn't be any complications, because they could easily have sabotaged something like that. Yeah, we try to be open about that, and so like I said, whatever they knew, everybody else knew. You know, there were no secrets going on.
The other, y'all were involved in a lot of actions. I'm trying to hit the bigger ones. The moratorium that y'all had, my notes indicate July 26, 1970. What was y'all's role in that?
We did not organize that, but we were involved as far as our participation of getting people together from the north side. What part of town was that in? Do you have
that? Was it took place in Magnolia Park,
yeah,
at Hidalgo Park.
Right. So that was organized by the moratorium people. I think there was some involvement possibly from California people as well, the moratorium there. It was a Chicano thing, though, which is great, you know. But our involvement came later, after the thing had already started moving. And essentially what we did is get people from the north side and take them down there, plus our own participation in the thing. We got involved in the negotiations with the city about this business of whether we were going to give us a permit to march on the street, whether we could march on the sidewalk, and all this business, you know, the usual stuff. And finally the city, this was Louis Welch, finally the city said, no, we're not going to grant you a permit, and if you march on the street, we're going to arrest you. Okay, well, I mean, that's all we needed, you know, I mean, it's perfect, you know. They never even tried to stop us. We went right down the street, and that was it. There was no incidents of any kind. There was lots of police out there. There was a lot of people from the community just coming out, sitting on the front porch, that kind of thing, because it was right in the neighborhood. It was really one of the best things that ever happened in Houston, as far as I was concerned, in terms of the Chicano community, because there was so much patriotism. I mean, that's kind of a traditional stance by Chicanos, you know, very, very patriotic, very American, all this kind of stuff. And the Vietnam War was particularly difficult because of that, you know, in terms of, I mean, we could see how we were being exploited and oppressed and everything else, and yet people were supporting this thing, and they were sending their sons out there to be killed disproportionately, all the usual kinds of arguments. And I think this rally kind of helped people come to grasp with the fact that we were being screwed in this whole thing. I mean, not only was it an immoral war, but we were being taken advantage of, as a group, as a people. So, anyway, we had the demonstration. It was a huge demonstration. I mean, I think the paper said something like 3,000 or something. Again, we dealt with these issues, about disproportionate killing.
Did you speak at them?
Yeah, I spoke at that one. And I don't remember whether Yolanda did as well. There were several other people there. Like, it wasn't a MAYO thing per se. I think we were at the head of the march simply because we were the ones who were saying, screw the police, we're going to march wherever we want to march. So we kind of pushed the thing into action, so we ended up at the front for that reason. And then people just sort of followed and did it, once they saw that we were not going to get our heads busted for marching in the street.
What was your position on the war? Do you remember the words you said, generally speaking, at the...
Well, I think I talked about, again, the involvement of Chicanos in that war in terms of the numbers versus our population, the whole disproportionate killing. I talked about the whole machismo issue, and I talked about this patriotic, sort of blind patriotism that Chicanos are famous for. I mentioned the fact that we had more Congressional Medal of Honors than any other group and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time criticizing the war as being, just ridiculous, immoral. And talking about what are these people, what do they have to come home to once they finish? The ones who do come home, look what they have to come back home to, So what is the point, What do we gain from attacking these people who have never done anything? I've never been insulted by any Vietnamese. I have no relationship to that. That was essentially what we were, the issues we were trying to deal with. This was, we were involved in 3 or 4 anti-war demonstrations. And
do you remember any of the specifics of the other ones? That's
yeah, one of them was organized by organizations like, the War Moratorium people. These were primarily white radical organizations, or liberal, not necessarily radical. And this was a demonstration. These all happened around the same general time period. That started off, this was a long one, it started at Allen's Landing and ended up at Herman Park at the hill there. I mean, that's a long march. It was a pretty big one, too. I mean, it was pretty substantial. And it was primarily white organizations. We were the only sort of Chicano contingent in the thing. And again, in fact, there was an editorial in the U of H Cougar denouncing me for what I said at that particular occasion.
Do you remember what you'd said?
Yeah.
Just the same thing? Or?
No, at that point I started to talk about the whole racism issue in relation to the war, and started talking about how, you're in a privileged situation, you can get your college deferment, or you can get this, and so on and so forth. Trying to point out, because it was primarily a young white crowd, point out to them that even though they had to deal with the war just like we did, they still had some privileges that would allow them to escape. But I'm sure I was very kind of heated about the way I said it, So I think that kind of antagonized some people. So I was criticized for antagonizing, people or whatever, which is ridiculous, Again, we always try to find a different point of view or about a particular issue that was going on. Everybody knew the war was bad, so I didn't have to go up there and tell them. Obviously, these were all believers. But we always try to find the same thing with the school boycott, to talk about racism between Mexicans and blacks and so on. To point out the basic problem, that keeps people apart, that keeps them from organizing and uniting in an effective way. Try to emphasize, what our common goals should be, but at the same time we have to deal with the problems that separate us. So we did antagonize people intentionally. And I think even though it may have upset them a little bit at the time, I think ultimately it was something that they needed to hear, they needed to deal with, So there was more to the war than just killing. I mean, there was the whole structure of this country that was involved here. And that's what we try to deal with as well, See, I was involved in draft counseling while I was in high school, through... God, who was the guy that I can't remember who introduced me to it, but so I had already gotten very heavily involved in this whole Vietnam issue, and had been doing draft counseling, got my conscientious objector status.
Oh, you were CO?
I was CEO.
How'd you do that?
Well, it was very simple, really. It just followed the procedures. You know, I simply said that I was a conscientious objector, so they sent me the proper form. I filled it out. I wrote an essay. You were required to write this essay for them. And then you go before your draft board, and they question you. And if they decide you're sincere in what you're saying, then they give you your CO. If not, then there was all kinds of appeals that you could go through. I mean, this thing could drag on for years, basically. So, you know, but I didn't go any further than the draft board, which was...
You got it right there.
And it was real strange because the draft board was basically from the Heights. And it was all these old white people, you know, these old white men and an old white woman. And they're sitting there asking me these questions about, you know, my morality, my religion, this and that. And I was pretty much of an atheist at the time, or at least I sort of felt that I was an atheist. But I managed to rationalize it by simply saying that my original my ideas about killing and war and morality were developed when I was a Catholic, and that was the basis for it. And that by watching on television what was going on, that it had just reinforced my beliefs. Even though I didn't consider myself a Christian, I considered myself that the basis for my morality was from religious teaching and so on. They accepted it. You know, I think they were just so damn surprised to have somebody from that particular board, and a Mexican at that, you know, just walk in there and start, you know, philosophically explaining, you know, why the whole thing was wrong. I just don't think they could. They understood what was happening, you know, and so they said, well, you know, we can't deal with this guy. Let's, you know, he's probably legit, you know. I don't know. They gave it to me.
But y'all participated in that other long march out to Herman Park. Any others that come to mind?
There were several other demonstrations, anti-war. There was one in Austin that we were involved in, which was pretty good also. This was in that, I forgot what part of Austin is. There's a Chicanos area in Austin, and again it was a park thing that we attended also, and which I spoke at. And there was one like in the Valley or something, Warden, or I'm not sure where. No, that's not in the Valley, but there was one in the Valley also, I think, that we were involved in. It was a small demonstration, because we would go out of town on some of these things.
I was about to say, what did y'all do out of town? Did y'all ever attend, did you ever attend conferences?
We attended that big MAYO convention that was at in Mission, Texas, which was held in that old mission that they took over at one point. And I think the church finally turned it over to them or something. But we attended that national, or we attended a MAYO conference there, which was like workshops and that kind of thing. And
who went?
Everybody went. we just got everybody together and, you know, got a bunch of cars and stuff and just went. I mean, the 14-year-olds went. Everybody went. Yolanda, Poncho, on down the line. I mean, we had kids with us even.
Was that in 70 or 71? Do you remember the date? I'm not familiar with that. I'm speaking right now out of ignorance.
That may have been in 70. It was kind of early. Yeah, it was kind of early.
Was it a couple of day conference?
Yeah, I think it was about 3 days or something. And you know, they were playing all these weird games. There was all this security business going on, people walking around with guns or rifles and shit, you know, and it was ridiculous because, I mean, you can't have a shootout with those people. They'll blow you away, you know, but, I mean, that was what was going on. Then we went to a so-called MAYO board meeting, which was held in some park out in that area also, again for security purposes. I mean,
was it at the same time, or was it a different?
More, a little later, but you know, a little bit after that.
What was y'all's input into that? Do you remember?
Very little. They really didn't want to hear what we had to say. I don't think we were there to be lectured at, basically, to be told to cool it, you know. And
who was running the show at that time?
The person who was doing the talking, let's put it that way. God, what's his name? He was like there was Mario from San Antonio, Mario Cantu, who was a really nice person, really good person, and Jose Angel Gutierrez, and there was the third guy, and he was kind of like the bully of the group.
That wasn't Carlos Guerra, was it?
Carlos Guerra.
He was Rasunida.
No, it wasn't Carlos Guerra. It was another guy, and I can't remember his name right now. They just wanted to make sure we didn't get too out of control, you know. I mean, this was after the church and all this other stuff. And because Rasunida was starting to develop that time, and they were afraid we would jeopardize, well, they were afraid we would jeopardize some of the federal funding that was coming through for different, they were setting up a school and a university and all this kind of stuff in the valley. And they were afraid that if Houston MAYO kept, you know, raising hell and creating problems, that it was going to jeopardize their funding. So we were basically told to sort of, you know, just don't do these things anymore. It made no difference to us what they told us we were going to. I mean, we talked about, well, we'll just change our name. You know, we don't have to have MAYO as the umbrella or whatever. But that never happened. But you know, so, and the other times we would go out of town would be, for example, in Sugar Land at one time, the union, I think it was, called us in, and, you know, to come in and do a rally kind of thing. And
which union?
I don't even remember what the issue was. It was just a real quick, it was so strange.
Farm workers? Or
it may have been the farm workers, actually. I remember I was so out of it, I didn't know what was going on, basically, that I just sort of got caught up in my own words at one point, you know, and it's like, cause I know that because I heard a tape of it later, and I was sounded really bad. I mean, everything was getting all mixed up, you know. We did several things like that where people would write us and say, there's a bunch of racists out here. Can you come out here and help us organize a MAYO chapter? So we ended up being placed in the position of being organizers for, you know, chapters outside of Houston, when really that was the responsibility of the San Antonio people or whatever, you know, the state organization.
When y'all went then you said Richmond or Rosenberg? Which one did you said?
No, we went to Sugar Land.
Sugar Land.
Yeah. And
any other places that y'all went
we
to
went
organize
to,
chapters?
is that Warden, in the sort of in the valley, Warden? We went to, it had to do with an incident of a doctor that was shot in a clinic. That was
Fred Logan?
Yes. We were down there for that demonstration. And there was a march along the highway or something as well.
Do you remember the particulars of that at all? I mean, how long did y'all stay at?
We were there, we got there in the morning, and I guess we left the next day. It was very quick. We basically just participated in the march and the rally. But we've been getting a lot of publicity and stuff, so people wanted us to show up. You know, I mean, we sort of became like celebrities within the organization.
Would you say that y'all were perceived as, here I'm putting words in your mouth, but just picking up what I've been reading and by what you said, were y'all perceived as more outspoken of the MAYO groups? Yeah,
essentially that was the image, because most of the other MAYO organizations, I mean, with the exception of the original Crystal City walkout and all that, there were no action. I mean, they became very much involved in proposal writing and setting up their own institutions, essentially. They weren't as involved with demonstrations and action kinds of things, you know, quick kinds of. And this had to do, I think, because by that time they were already involved in this Rasunida thing, or they were trying to get that going. And so that's that, and the university, which was in Mission, in that old Mission that we had the convention in. That was their emphasis, was getting that university going, and there was a lot of money involved here that they were trying to give, and trying to get Rasunida going as well. So that was their emphasis, and the other chapters just, I mean, really, I mean, there aren't that many cities in Houston where things could happen. There aren't that many Chicanos in Dallas, for example. So most of the activity was in Houston, was in San Antonio, and the Valley, you know, and Austin. There was a chapter there, I think, or there was activity there at any rate. But that was mostly centered around the Vietnam War.
Did you, other than these, did y'all have very close association with other? Do you remember other individuals in MAYO in other towns that y'all had close association with, that you would consider close kindred association?
Well, there were lots of people who would sort of, you know, ask for us to appear, kind of thing, you know, attend their rallies or help them organize or whatever. But we would just kind of go in there, do it, be there a day,
or two and then leave. I mean, we really didn't feel that it was our responsibility or even I didn't feel it was our right to do this. They had to do it. You know, we'd give them the moral support and we'd show up for their rallies and stuff. But it was their community and they had to do it. You know, we had enough to deal with on our own, you know. So, no, most of our associations were through either the state MAYO people or people involved in the moratorium kind of thing, you know. But we were pretty independent, you know. We really didn't have much to do with other organizations other than supporting some of their actions, some of their activities and stuff. The only coalition idea, you probably, I don't know, was when we got involved in this coalition with, I think it was called the Rainbow Coalition. This is for Jesse.
It really was called
Yeah,
Rainbow
it was
Coalition.
called the Rainbow Coalition with People's Party 2 and John Brown Revolutionary League. And
How did that come about?
well, I mean, I knew all those people from the old SDS Space City days, basically, and that was what was his name? Can't remember. Gee, I can't remember these people's names.
Which one now?
The head of the thing, basically,
Barty Hale?
Barty Hale, yeah, who I had known for years, you know, and he was one of the people who, when I was in Space City and stuff, kind of would push the idea on me and Alex, like, you know, you guys got to get your own thing going, you know, got to get some Chicano community. You know, so he always had that kind of an attitude about our role in the revolution or whatever. So, and Yolanda was very fond of him as well, you know, they just, and as far as
Did you like him pretty well?
yeah, I'd probably still like him if I saw him again, you know. Yeah, we got on really well. He was not, you know, this weird, hot-headed whatever. I mean, he was a very rational person, you know. I mean, he could be very rational, even though he felt very strongly about issues, you know. He was not a kook, you know, and he was very intelligent.
He was not a kookish.
He was not at all, you know, quite the opposite. Very serious, very, you know, concerned about issues and stuff. They more than us, really did get into all this pick up the gun business, you know, which was a mistake, as it turned out. I mean,
What was your attitude towards pick up the gun?
well, I mean, unfortunately, we got involved in this kind of machismo trip, and felt we couldn't back down since we had agreed to be part of a coalition. When that incident on Dowling Street, because before the killing, there was a series of incidents on Dowling Street where they shot up the Panther, or they weren't the Panthers, they were People's Party 2. They shot up the office a couple of times, and this was the police involved in all this stuff. So there was like an emergency meeting type thing called, and
Let's back up for just a second, Gregorio. When would you say that? How long before that did y'all get involved in that coalition, and was it a formally established coalition? I mean, did y'all have a meeting, you know?
it was definitely a formal arrangement that we had with them. Essentially, the idea behind it was that we would support one another, we would back one another up.
Who cut the agreement? I mean, who?
Nobody cut the agreement.
Who fashioned the agreement?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Yeah.
It was essentially, I would say, the John Brown people, and I would say they probably spearheaded the thing.
Y'all were approached, in other
We were
words.
approached after they and People's Party 2 had pretty much, you know, already formed some sort of an alliance or whatever.
So y'all were brought in as sort of the third component of
Right.
it.
But as far as that whole gun business goes, and that particular incident, you know, we were sort of held out in all these dilapidated buildings on Dowling Street, you know, with guns, waiting for the police to come. I mean, it was totally stupid, you know.
How long before that happened had y'all made the agreement to coalesce?
Had y'all been a coalition long, or?
Not too long, a few months maybe, or less, a couple of months perhaps. And we'd attended demonstrations with them, and mostly around the around the Vietnam War, the moratorium, and that kind of thing. But when they started shooting up People's Party 2 office, and that's when this thing came up, you know. I mean, it wasn't like we were forced into it or anything.
No.
I don't want to give that impression. I mean, everybody wanted to do it. You know, I'm sure we were all scared as hell, but everybody wanted to do it. We felt we had a responsibility to these people. We'd made an agreement, you know, and we had to back them up. So we did. And I think, like I said, some of it had to do with machismo on everybody's part, not just MAYO, but the other organizations. I mean, they were really just not thinking.
What was the sequence? Do you remember the sequence of events that led up to this? I mean, kind of give us, let's try to remember some of the specifics of it.
Well, I think basically they were trying to run People's Party 2 out of town. I mean,
the cops were.
Yeah, because I mean they were obviously affiliated with the Black Panthers, and there was a lot of hysteria about the Black Panthers, and so it was just their little. They felt they could get away with it. You know, it's just a bunch of crazy radical blacks. You know, nobody cares about them, and so it was just a continuous harassment, violent harassment. You know, shooting up the office, that kind of thing. And it just kept building and building, and until eventually they said, well, we've got to arm ourselves and protect ourselves and all that kind of thing. And for several days this went on, you know, this kind of rotating, well, we'll take it this night, you take it that night.
Did they call you all up about this?
Yeah, we pretty much decided, you know, worked something out where we would, you know, be there.
Was this said in a meeting, or was it just more informal than that?
I think by that point it was more informal. You know, we were just sort of dealing with the situation. We were going down to their office at this point. In other words,
On Dowling.
Yeah, we were going down to Dowling, you know, during the day and having discussions about what's going on and how we were going to deal with it and so on. And then at night, you know, again, it was purely volunteer. You didn't have to do it. And it was stupid because...
Who had the guns? I mean...
Well, I'd rather not say.
Okay.
But we weren't really equipped or capable of dealing with the situation. If it had happened to us, you know, it would have been terrible. But and then things things kind of quieted down, you know, after a while. I mean, there was all this marching up and down Dowling and carrying on, and things.
Did y'all actually carry guns out on the street? I mean, did members?
We were very blunt about it, being on the street with them. Yeah. But then things just kind of quieted down for a while, and then a little later they finally killed him.
Well, where were y'all when that did y'all actually?
We weren't there at the time.
I have heard that y'all had actually spent the night there one night with guns in hand.
Yeah.
Is that?
That's true. It wasn't the night of the killing, however. Like I said, things kind of quieted down a little bit, and then